that. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for being here today. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. This is a wonderful crowd. My name is Carrie Cisna, and I'm the executive director here at the Interfaith Center. And this is a very important topic, a very important discussion. There's a lot of differing opinions, and the main purpose of us having the Interfaith Center is to bring people together across differing opinions to create a safe space so that we can hear from each other and learn from each other. And so we're going to start by hearing a little bit more about what is Roe v. Wade, what was this decision that was recently made. So for some of us who are not as informed as we should be, including myself, I just want to know, what is this big deal? Why is everyone so upset? What are the concerns on all sides? And we're going to hear from Dr. Kimberly Hamlin, who is a wonderful, amazing professor here at Miami University, to get started. And at the end, we'll hope to open it up for some questions and some dialogue. If we don't get to too much dialogue, because there's so many of us here today, we will do a follow-up conversation where all we do is just discuss and learn from each other. We have City Councilwoman Amber Franklin here with us today, who's going to be leading our living room conversation, but we will definitely need to have another living room conversation where we can continue to learn. So if you don't mind, I'm going to mute everyone online, and Dr. Hamlin, take it away.
Hi, so nice to see you all today. I know we have many folks from some of my classes. We have some folks from the center next door who are perhaps here with other agendas and interests and stakes in this issue. I'm coming here as a historian to talk about the history of abortion rights and why the historians think this is really central and a core tenet of women's personhood and equality. So from a historical context, I just wanted to start off with a few basic principles, and then Carrie had sent me some questions in advance that we could also, we'll talk about them. We'll open it up to the floor. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So one more. There we go. So the first point I want to make clear is women have always had abortions. This is a trans historical international fact that is beyond dispute. And so this is an essay that a colleague of mine, Lauren McIver-Thompson, another historian, published in the New York Times. You may recall a few years ago, the late journalist Cokie Roberts, may she rest in peace, went on NPR and basically said, I did a Google search about abortions in history and I didn't find anything. And the historians were like, oh my gosh, you can't Google it. Like, people didn't write like a letter to the editor saying, today I had an abortion. You have to use your historical framework and how you interpret the archival material and the sources that you look for and what you find. So she published this great essay. And what I like about it is like a photo essay where she also includes some of the primary sources and helps walk readers through some of the work that historians, like we learn to do in class. What are questions about sources? What might we ask about sources? So this is just one resource you might look to understand how and why it is that historians know women have always had abortions. And in the US in particular, abortions were not illegal until the mid to late 19th century. Prior to the quickening, which is the time period of which usually between the second and third trimester when you can feel a baby moving, it was considered just something, a woman decides with her midwife. So you can see examples of this in the great book, A Midwife's Tale by the historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. That's the book that says well-behaved women rarely make history. You have that bumper sticker. It's from that book. Another source you can look to is an essay by Cornelia Dayton Hughes, a historian who has written about the first case that she found in colonial archives documenting an abortion, and that was from colonial Connecticut. And the issue at stake there, what brought this case to the courts and why it persists in the historical record, is because the woman died. So she uses that as a way to say, how were people thinking and talking about abortion in colonial times? Well, no one said a peep about the fetus or fetal rights or fetal personhood. The only crime was that the woman died. So what was the sin that was committed in this case in the 1700s in colonial Connecticut was premarital sex. People were upset that premarital sex had occurred and that then the woman died after having an abortion. So anyway, these are some of the historical sources that we look to as historians to see this trans historical fact that women have always had abortions. When does abortion become illegal? That would be the next slide. And that's into the mid to late 1800s. And in the notes part of the slide, I have who these folks are and where I got. These are just images from Wikipedia, commonly available. This is Dr. Horatio Storer. He was a gynecologist, and as the students in my 350 class know, gynecology became a medical specialization in the mid to late 19th century, 1800s. And gynecology as a field was developed on the non-consensual bodies of enslaved women. And so the father of gynecology, that's not, this guy's one of those guys, he's not the guy I'm about to say, J. Marion Sims practiced and perfected his techniques on the non-consensual bodies of unanesthetized enslaved women, basically in like a makeshift hospital, kind of hospital even sounds generous, makeshift shack on the back of a plantation. And this is part of the context of when gynecology becomes a field. And Storer, this guy Horatio Storer, is another pioneering mid-19th century gynecologist who did not necessarily work on the bodies of enslaved women, but uses the institutionalization of medicine, which is happening in the 19th century as medicine becomes professionalized. The AMA establishes itself. You have to become a credentialed doctor in order to practice, to wrest control of reproductive medicine from midwives. That's the sort of takeaway of this, that the reason abortion becomes illegal in part is because men like Horatio Storer are seeking to professionalize, masculinize medicine, put up barriers to women's participation, and take over from midwives who historically had been the ones to perform reproductive health care and all sorts of health care on the bodies of women. As men seek to take control, part of this effort is to criminalize abortion. And that's the historical context that we start seeing state laws banning abortion come up in the late 19th century. The other part of the story is this guy, Anthony Comstock. Anthony Comstock is an anti-vice reformer in New York City, or New York State more broadly. After the Civil War, people like Anthony Comstock are super concerned about young people moving to the cities. After the Civil War, young people who previously would live in their parents' home, who would date in their parents' home, who would court in their parents' home, are now living with their friends in big apartment complexes or boarding houses. They are unchaperoned. They are reading naughty magazines. What are they doing? Who is in charge of them? There are many aspects of these broader concerns about vice. And Anthony Comstock kind of hones in on mostly printed materials, and he succeeds first in having New York State pass anti-vice or anti-obscenity legislation, which then gets adopted by the federal government in 1872. These are under the umbrella of the Comstock laws. And the Comstock laws, we look at this, remember we read this out loud in 350, ban basically the writing, selling, drafting, sharing, copying, thinking about, touching, relaying, looking at, thinking about looking at, I'm exaggerating a little bit, not much, the spread of obscene material. And what is obscene is what Anthony Comstock says is obscene. He then gets appointed postal inspector. So this Comstock laws is what many early birth control pioneers are imprisoned for, violating the Comstock laws, circulating pamphlets, even innocuous like anatomy textbooks, things we would think is basic, like this is your body and these are the names of your organs, would be considered in some cases obscene under the Comstock laws. So this is part of the way that abortion, and so he also goes after abortion providers who would advertise, for example, in the press, even though they did so in veiled language that wouldn't necessarily come up just if you search abortion. That's how people got arrested, and that's how abortion becomes made illegal. Next slide. One thing to think about then is how abortion becomes legal for the slightly less than 50 years, beginning with Roe v. Wade. A broad coalition of folks in the 1960s, including many faith leaders, which surprises a lot of people. But for this, I would turn you or refer you to a historian named Gillian Frank, who writes extensively about all the faith and religious leaders who banded together along with physicians in the American Medical Association to begin lobbying for abortion to become legalized. Why? Women always and already and will always have abortions. And there were because it was illegal, many women were suffering and dying. This struck faith leaders, medical leaders as a problem. So they worked together with women's rights activists, other health reformers to begin advocating for a change in the law. This happens state by state, right? So we have sort of a patchwork of laws. And the other part of this story is the birth control pill also was approved by the FDA in 1960. And at the same time, finally, nearly 100 years later is when the Comstock laws begin to be overturned. And that is Griswold v. Connecticut, which begins the overturning of the Comstock laws, happening also in the late 1960s, early 1970s, in the context of Roe. So I have Ruth Bader Ginsburg here because there was two different ideas about how to advocate for abortion rights. One idea that because of Comstock, and you might still be saying, why are we talking about this Comstock guy? He's not a physician, he's not really talking about women's bodies, but he's talking a lot about sex, and that's how people got arrested, was under the Comstock law. So birth control pioneers had long said what we need is to overturn the Comstock laws. And one way we could do that is to say this is a private matter. It should not be the place of the state to decide what we can talk about when it comes to our bodies and our health. So that's kind of one arm of this. The other arm of this is the equality argument. And this was another school of thought pioneered by a little known birth control reformer named Mary Ware Dennett. And she said, you know, I don't want to argue about privacy. I want to argue that what happens to my body is because I'm an equal human who should decide and have bodily autonomy. So I want to argue based on this notion of equality, that women are people. So that is the path that Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought that abortion rights should be argued under, the equality clause of the 14th Amendment. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's equality path did not prevail. So Roe v. Wade is decided on the grounds of privacy. And it's in this larger context of the overturning of Comstock. And I'm again highlighting this here because a lot of folks are wondering about some of the wording in the Dobbs decision, which overturns Roe v. Wade, that other rights also guaranteed under this privacy understanding, such as the laws that made that took sodomy, the laws that decriminalize sodomy also are under privacy. Same with same-sex marriage, so that in birth control. So there's an idea that if of all the rights previously guaranteed under this umbrella of privacy are gone, what does this mean for same-sex marriage? What does this mean for non-heterosexual sex? What does this mean for birth control? These are the privacy. These are things that are brought to us under the privacy interpretation. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought that a stronger road to have argued Roe v. Wade would have been equality, that women should be able to access reproductive rights because women are people. And women are people above and beyond their reproductive capacity and should be able to decide what happens to them. Also in the context, and I guess we will save this for later, but I want to say a lot about sexual assault and rape. Next. So you might also be wondering, okay, what's the difference between reproductive rights and reproductive justice? These are terms that we hear a lot. So this is a picture of Fannie Lou Hamer, who went before the Democratic National Convention in the 1960s to talk about her own experiences with sexual assault and sexual harassment as a Black woman living in the South, which was commonplace, as we've been spending a lot of time in my 350 talking about how rape and sexual assault have been the perhaps strongest, most vicious tools of white supremacy from basically the beginning until now. So Black women have long led the fight against sexual assault, and people wonder, what does this mean for reproductive rights and reproductive justice? Well, there's also a history of reproductive rights advocates talking about rights, meaning the right to have or have, in many cases, the right to not get pregnant. But for Black women, it means something different often, because of the way in which this longer history of sexual assault and rape, coupled with the way in which many African-American women, including Fannie Lou Hamer, which is why she's the picture of this, were forcibly sterilized. Another thing that Fannie Lou Hamer talked about throughout her long career was what she called her Mississippi appendectomy, when she went to the doctor as a young woman and thought she was having one procedure, but found out after that she had been received a hysterectomy without her consent, without her knowledge, and how common this was throughout the 20th century. And you can even trace it into the 21st century if you want to look at some stories that are emerging about what happens in ICE facilities to women who are being held there against their will from trying to immigrate to America. Other stories of forced sterilization have been leaked out from those places as well. So reproductive justice is a more broader term to think about the ways in which women can might have full bodily autonomy, the right to not be raped, the right to not receive a hysterectomy against your will, so to speak. Okay, so I wanted to foreground that as well. And another context we might think about. Okay. I guess I don't have the slide I thought I had. So hold on. Do I have one more after this? No, okay, I just had two other points. So one thing I've been saying a lot, I write a lot and I talk to a lot of reporters, and one message that I have as a historian is I often hear people say in the wake of the Dobbs decision. So Dobbs is the Mississippi case that outlawed abortion after a certain time period that was in violation of Roe. The Supreme Court decided that it could stand, meaning Roe is overturned across the nation. So in the wake of this, people are wondering what it means. And a lot of folks are saying, oh, it's going to be just like before. We're going back. It's going to be like before. And what I want to say is, it is not like before. It is so much worse for women than before. And this is I put in the notes that this is from the Cincinnati Enquirer from 1970, the historian Gillian Frank that I mentioned earlier. He shared this on Twitter the other day, and I thought this would be interesting to show like what it was like before. So one of the ways this is not like before is previous state bans on abortion included exceptions for rape, incest, life, health of the mother. The majority of the current state bans on abortion that are now the law in many states after the overturning of Roe v. Wade include no such exceptions for rape, incest, or life of the mother, or health of the mother. In some cases life, but in some cases not health. To me, this is shocking. As you may know, I teach a class on Me Too. A lot of you are in it. Sexual assault, especially on college campuses, is a national health crisis. Sexual assault, especially for women of color, especially for trans folk, is an epidemic. How can we not include a ban or an exception, in these bans for rape and sexual assault when these are public health crises up until today? So this is not like before. The other way this is not like before is the internet. So before Roe, there's many stories of how women banded together to provide their own abortion. So one source in particular I might send you to is a book by Laura Kaplan called Jane. It's the history of a bunch of women, mostly in Chicago, who took matters into their own hands and working with actually many local ministers to educate themselves about how their bodies worked and to learn how to provide abortions themselves and for each other. So you would call a number and you would say, I want to speak with Jane. That was the code word. And so basically pre-Roe, if you wanted to get an abortion, you probably could. It might be awful. You might die. It might be terrifying, but you could probably get it. Now, the way in which many of these state bans are awarded, especially, for example, the law in Texas, which says anyone who aids or abets a person having an abortion is also committing a crime/felony. Depends on the state and the level. You are also going to be arrested. So, and because of our phones tracking our search term history, our every move, our every phone call, our every text, all of these things could potentially be subpoenaed. So there's not the pre-internet universe where you pick up the phone and you make a phone call, or you search something at the library and there's not a record of it. Now there's much more likely to be some sort of a record of what people do. There's other ways that it's not like before, we could talk more about, but to me, the lack of exceptions for rape and sexual assault and health are the really glaring ways that this is not like before. The other, I guess that's all I wanted to say. The other point I wanted to say was about the public health crisis of sexual assault and harassment.
So you mentioned this already. Who are the people that will be impacted by this decision? Would you add anything?
So there's been a lot of great reporting on who has abortions in 2022. The vast majority of folks who have abortions are folks who already have kids, are folks who live below that or below the poverty level, and are women of color. So the people who will most likely be impacted are those folks who will not necessarily have the resources to travel out of state or to know who to call or text to help them obtain Plan B or one of the abortion pills that one could obtain in 2022. So that's primarily who will be affected. Young women, women of color, women who are already mothers, and women who have fewer resources.
Okay. Why can it be so difficult to talk about abortion? What is really at the heart of the debate? Can you tell us what the concerns are from various perspectives?
I mean, I don't know if I want to talk about various perspectives. I have a feeling, especially since so many other perspectives have joined us today. From my perspective, I would say the concern that women are not full people is a big part of that. Women are inherently mothers, and that this is somehow prescribed in certain religions, that women are supposed to be primarily mothers, and that the life of a fetus should somehow be equal to or more important than the life of the mother. But that is also varies by faith. For example, a lot of folks who are Jewish do not have the same ideas about when life begins, whose life counts. So they have made, I think, and they're bringing some lawsuits forward to say that laws that are premised on the idea that fetuses have legal rights violate Jewish faith, because that is not a thing that people who are Jewish subscribe to.
Okay.
Well, and the sexual double standard is the other thing. I think in large part, this is a debate about the sexual double standard, and if women are allowed to have sex for pleasure, if women are allowed to have sex before marriage, if women are allowed to have sex when and where they want to, and also if women are not allowed to have sex when they don't want to.
Okay. That's a lot to think about. So there are labels like pro-choice and pro-life that often oversimplify positions, and they pit us against one another. Which, if any, gray areas have you identified?
In labels, I mean, you're right, the labeling is,
Yeah.
I know there's many great examples of folks working together on various parts of this issue, such as adoption, which as a historian, I can also tell you does not have a great history. So if you want to read another harrowing history, I would suggest you read about the history of adoption and the ways in which that has been used as a tool of white supremacy as well. So, but there are some examples of, I would say, coalitions coming together. Also, some examples of coalitions coming together are folks who work together for women's health and to provide especially greater access to prenatal care for women, because that's another thing one might expect to see is a broad-based support for prenatal, maternal, and infant health care in the US, when in fact, statistically, you are way more likely to die, especially if you are a woman of color in the United States during childbirth or as part of being pregnant than in basically all of the other industrialized countries. So we actually have terrible maternal fetal health outcomes. So there are some, I think I've seen some great examples of people who have maybe different ideas about abortion still working together to provide a broader access to maternal and fetal health care.
Yeah, it kind of goes into this. Has anything good come from this decision? Have you seen people inspired towards social action or any innovation for social change? Anything good? And also anything we can do?
So, I mean, one thing I want to say is women will die because of the overturning of Dobbs, for sure. So it's hard for me to say, like, but on the plus side,
Yeah.
So women will suffer and die. History shows us that is clear. On the plus side, maybe I'm hoping that a lot more young people will be involved and will really take voting more seriously, for example, will really take a larger part of their communities, running for office across. I know we have many young folks here glaring at me from the pro-life group. So I know, well, from many sides of the aisle, we will run for office and do all sorts of good work. So I hope that it'll be a good motivator for young people to get more involved in politics. I had one other thing to say about something good that might come out of it. Oh, that maybe Ruth Bader Ginsburg, may she rest in peace, will get her wish, and that we may end up with like a much more comprehensive road to abortion that's not based on this sort of narrow, seemingly capricious right to privacy, but instead based on the idea that women are people. So that's a lot of what's animating the debates today about the ERA, that the ERA, a lot of anti-choice and pro-life folks are united against the ERA now, not so much because of what it says in the short, 2 sentences that it contains, but that it might be applied to argue for abortion rights, that if we do in fact agree that women are equal and full citizens, must we then also provide healthcare for them in full bodily and reproductive autonomy? So I think it's also reanimating debates about equality, and maybe at some future point after many women suffer and die, we'll have a broader access. And I think the polls on this are clear. If you think about Kansas, when abortion has come before the people, this is an example of where our elected officials are not in line with what the majority of folks want. I even heard a story on WBXU this morning on my way to campus about Ohio. So in Kansas, as you may know, the voters put it to a state referendum, and it was overwhelmingly that they opposed having a statewide ban on abortion. Nationally, polls show 60+ people want there to be some legal path to abortion, not necessarily, all times and all places for all people, but some path to abortion more than 60%. That is true even in Ohio, according to this report I heard this morning on WBXU. But our state legislatures often pass different laws that are not in line with the majority of public opinion.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts?
I mean, another thing I would say, and this is a big part of my life, is about voting rights. I would say in terms of what people can do, the most important thing we can do as citizens is vote, and also work to support the voting rights of everyone. It comes as some surprise, I think, to a lot of folks that in our Constitution, there is no right to vote. There's a lot of, okay, you can't discriminate by race. That's the 15th Amendment. You can't discriminate by sex. That's the 19th Amendment. But within that, there's a lot of other wiggle room to discriminate. And we've seen a real erosion of the Voting Rights Act since 2013. So a record number of laws since 2016, and even more since 2020. Designed to infringe and impinge and make it harder for folks to vote. So I would say that to me, like right now, abortion and reproductive rights is like a luxury issue for me. And I feel like my number one issue is voting rights. If we don't have voting rights, no matter what your number one issue is, who cares? First, we have to have voting rights.
Yeah.
And then, that's a basis of our democracy.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and bringing us up to speed. Yeah, do you want to thank her for being here and for the chat? So we will open it up to thoughts from all of you. Councilwoman Franklin, would you like to share a little bit about how we will engage?
Sure. So thank you all for being here. I've seen some of you before. I know some of you came to council when we had the resolution, the reproductive freedom resolution, and I appreciated the stories and perspectives you shared. This is a wonderful experience, and thank you, Dr. Hamlin, for speaking. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to come together as a community and share our different perspectives, even when we don't agree, and frankly, because we don't agree. I think that it's, we often have a Band-Aid solution to things where we think like, well, we have to come together so we can convince each other of our different perspectives. But I think that the victory is in being together in a room, listening to each other with curiosity, and experiencing that for its own merit. And so, in conversations, Sometimes perspectives change, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the motivation for the conversation. So there's a framework called Living Rooms Conversations. You can Google it. It's something that I've been wanting to get going in our community for a while. And we had a wonderful conversation right here a couple nights ago on religion and politics. It's meant to take more time than the half hour that we have. And it's meant to be done in smaller groups than what we've got right now. But I think this could be a good opportunity for us to get a little taste of it and hopefully gain some interest so that we can do this again and do this in smaller groups, like in different spaces and in different parts of town. But there are some principles around living room conversations, and they're listening with curiosity, listening without judgment, owning and guiding the conversation. And so what I'd like to do is maybe I'll just sort of ask, and also not dominating the conversational floor, especially when we only have about a half an hour. But what I'd like to do is just ask people to share a little bit about their personal perspectives on where we are in society and what your greatest concerns are right now regarding abortion.
Okay, I can start.
Can we get your name,
Oh, yeah,
please?
of course. I'm Molly Duffy. I'm a sophomore student at Miami this year, majoring in public administration, hopefully running for office one day. I'm also a civic engagement fellow at the Wilkes Institute, so a lot of my work focuses on nonpartisan voter registration and basically giving people information about voting. And I'm not sure if you guys know this, but Ohio is ranked the 41st worst state to vote in, as in like 50 is like the worst. So Ohio is up there for a lot of voter restrictions. And we actually did a survey in one of my public administration classes yesterday, where we had 37 students and we can count the data in class. The most important issue for these students was abortion. Out of the 37 students, their priority issue they wanted to focus on was abortion. I think that's interesting to point out because like in Ohio, at least like the perspective of like our elected officials in office is that people don't want abortion, but based on that survey and that one class alone with a mix of freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, abortion was the primary issue. And I do think that for me, at least, that is the primary issue that I was focusing on in this election too. And seeing that mostly like the Gen Z that were in the class do care about abortion, it's very important that Gen Z makes it to the polls and is able to express their opinions and who they vote for. So I'm just really happy to see that people are passionate about it and want to vote in the general election coming up on November 8th. So if you're registered to vote, please do everything that you can to register. We have free stamps to mail back your absentee ballots in the Wilkes office in 2018 in Armstrong. And I also have lots of information for you about voting in person as well. So make it to the polls on election day, vote early, send in your absentee ballot, and no matter what your opinion is, just express it and vote.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone else. Your name, please.
My name is Kristen O'Hare. I'm an alumna and a staff person. I just have to point out that making something illegal isn't a racism. The outlawing of abortion just outlaws safe abortions. We're going to go back to the 18th or 19th century where you get slippery elm bark and it's inserted into the cervix and it causes infection, abortion, and horrific pain. And I feel like that's where we're going to be. If doctors don't want to go to jail, which is completely understandable, then we're going to go down the alleys, we're going to go to quacks, and we're going to go to unadvised, self-inflicted operations.
Other experiences, concerns?
And some of those women are already mothers, which means that we will leave children motherless because of this. And that relates to the equality piece for me. I wonder if Dr. may know, is there any law at all that applies to control men's bodies in the same way that this controls women's bodies?
I mean, no. I mean, to the extent that there are any laws about male sexuality, like if you were thinking for example, about the history of rape, which we do a lot in my Me Too class. You know, the laws that are designed, like, not that rape is about sex, because it's about power, but anyways, they're not enforced
So women are
against
not-
white men anyway,
So
so
women are not considered equal citizens in this country.
not in this regard.
Yeah, I'm Anthony Chuck, and I think that addressing your concerns there's something very different about this, because the question is, what really is an abortion? And we can say, you know, people have different religious views of when life begins. We know that it's a human being because it's a human organism, right? That's what its parents are. It's alive, it's growing, it's taking in nutrients. The debate really starts to come into whether or not it's a person or not, and I don't think I'm going to be getting into that today. But my question is, do all human beings deserve equal protection under the law? And the fact is, if what it is we are killing a human organism, whether or not it's a person, is there any way that you could apply that to men? Because they physiologically don't have the capacity to have a human life within them, right? So they would never have an instance where they need to do it. And so, well, you were saying you think the primary issue is whether or not women are persons. I think a lot of it is whether the unborn are persons. And if they are, do we have a right to kill them under any circumstances? And when it comes to rape, that is an awful, horrible thing. And why I think it is so awful and horrible is because it is an act of violence against an innocent human being. The woman does nothing to deserve that. Nothing she could ever do could warrant that. How could it, right? To be violated in such a way. But I think when it comes to an abortion, that is also an act of violence against an innocent human being. That person didn't do anything to deserve that either. And so why should they be punished for the crime of the father? Because we don't even have death penalties against rapists, right? And if you aren't executing the rapist, why should you be executing an unborn child?
Thank you. Other thoughts?
The 10-year-old gave birth to Kimberly that would protect her body. And in some states, a 10-year-old can't get an abortion.
The historian who writes a lot about this, so the modern day life movement, and he said that the end goal is to establish fetal personhood at the federal level. This legislation has already been introduced. And then that would mean that the 14th Amendment would apply to fetuses. And so that's the end game. The end game is not overturning Roe. The end game is establishing fetal personhood. And a scholar who writes a lot about this, whose name I have just, Mary Ziegler. I was about to say it in a minute. Mary Ziegler has written 2 books in the past couple of years about the sort of legal precedent for this and what is coming. So I would, if you wanted to learn more about the move towards fetal personhood and what that would mean more broadly, I would recommend Mary Ziegler. Oh my gosh, sorry.
Children and education meant medical help for that child throughout their lives. The support that's given is essentially given every time concerns about feeding the mother and the child prior to birth. You have to fight tooth and nail to get that passed. That's ridiculous. Human life is not supported by our culture, period. And to punish women because of that, to me, is just cruel.
I'm wondering if anyone over the course of discussions around this have shifted perspective in any particular direction. And if so, what did that for you? Or are people sort of, they have their position and no one in this room feels like they've shifted at all?
Amber, could you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question is anyone, has anyone in this room shifted positions? And it doesn't have to be, I was pro and now, I'm anti-choice and now I'm pro-choice or the other way, but shifted along the continuum in some way. And if so, what did that for you? How did you come to shift your view?
I don't really know how to sort of frame this. It's really big picture thing. And I'm thinking of what Becky said. The fact is that I don't know how, my current is that 5 children, malnutrition every minute. People who are so concerned about, life, right to life. What about that? That's the injustice part. So many people just conveniently overlook.
Thank you. There was a hand here.
And it really,
That's okay.
it all gets back to patriarchy, white supremacy, racism, and political power, as opposed to feeling so deeply about, right to life.
Mm.
It's almost like this is something we can run with to stay in power or gain power. That's the big picture that I struggle with as far as how to address it, how to resist it.
Can you say your name for everyone in the room?
I'm sorry, I'm John.
All right.
Hamlin.
Thanks, John. Your name.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Breedis, and I would just like to say how thankful I am that everyone came out today to speak opinions that are close to their heart, that are passionate to them, and I really appreciate everyone's approach. Something that definitely stood out to me is how much support we need to gear towards women. Women need more support in general. We should have more counseling, more resources. Women shouldn't have to feel like they're alone if they become pregnant, or if they're in a choice where they feel like they need to have an abortion or not. As a survivor of sexual assault myself, I certainly know that there needs to be more options for women, and so they feel that they are not alone and that they have to make this choice, whether or not in a moment to choose to end a life or to carry on a pregnancy, and know that they're not alone and that they can find resources and support in others.
Thank you. One of the principles of Living Your Conversations is, and I wish I had remembered to say this at the beginning, is to note commonalities as well as differences, right? And so we're hearing comments where we can very quickly say, oh, I don't agree with that, but I hope we're hearing some things where we can say, no, I understand that we're aligned in that regard and not necessarily on everything. So thank you for sharing.
We do have a comment and a question online.
Mhm.
Amy, do you want to go ahead and make your comment?
She unmuted.
Hi, I'm available if people have questions on the Jewish law piece, which on this whole balance of status of personhood versus the personhood of the fetus versus the life of the pregnant person is where Jewish law has lengthy discussions. And these are discussions that have happened over a long period of time. There is biblical text on this issue. This is not just a modern question for Judaism. So I think there was also another individual who had a different question. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Sean Vaness. I was raised Catholic and I'm an Oxford resident. I spent time in Morocco where I was able to spend time with a lot of Muslims, and I was very excited to hear that it is in Muslim text by the Prophet Muhammad that pleasure is essential to their belief system. He prescribes and demands that husbands must also consider pleasure. And growing up Catholic, that was really easy to me. But when you asked, how have you shifted? And knowing that we're in this interfaith space, respecting other religions is important to know that you can see another side to this story. And also, I believe that there's texts in the Quran about like ways to avoid getting pregnant and times of the month when you can. So I think it's really important to expand. It was really important for me to expand my understanding of what sex was and not be afraid of getting pregnant, because that was my number one fear growing up as a woman.
The question, Menek, do you want to ask your question? Do you want me to read it? It says, are some churches violating the law by urging their followers to do protests as pro-lifers? And is separation of church and state being violated?
Is that a question for anyone in particular, or kind of a discussion question?
Yeah, does anybody want to answer that?
Maybe
Food for thought.
rhetorical.
Yeah,
for
food for
thought
thought.
question.
Good question.
I thought I saw a hand start to go up right around here. Yes, please.
And I feel that this conception is that my mother has worked for WIC for 20 years. So she works for women and citizen children. And when she heard about Roe v. Wade being overturned, her biggest concern is that her clientele is going to skyrocket. The areas that WIC is most prominent in are going to be areas where there are like higher populations of people of color. They're going to be higher populations of poverty. And so the age range that was, the comment that was made to me when I turned 18 was that I was now going to be, if someone my age came in, they were going to be one of the oldest people in there. The youngest girl that she had come in was 10. And these were not uncommon things. These are also women who they don't have resources. They don't have resources for their children. They don't have, so not only are they not having accessibility to resources regarding their own pregnancy, but they don't have resources once the child is here. So it becomes a concern because this feeds into an overarching system of oppression for these people, because it creates a cycle that they cannot get out of. And the overturning of Roe v. Wade will be detrimental for these areas. That probably has been detrimental for these areas, and makes it nearly impossible for people to get out of these situations, even if they want to, especially because a lot of, I mean, when you're talking about people who are between the ages of 10 and 17, and they're coming in massive numbers, it becomes also they can't ask these questions, but it can easily be assumed that most of these women are coming in due to rape. And so it's not even something that they could prevent at this point, and they get stuck. And I think that's going to be a very big concern, a very big issue that is seen in the next 10 years probably, as women are trying to navigate what to do with their lives and their bodies.
Okay. So I have to go back to teach a class. I came here between classes. I want us to just stop and think about what just happened here today.
Mhm.
And I think that a small town like Oxford is where these things can happen and happen most readily. I want two things to come from this. First of all, we will have a follow-up, not just on this topic, but other topics, some topics that might be kind of flashpoints and controversial issues in society, but other topics, I mean, Living Room Conversations has almost 200 topics: empathy, civic renewal. What does it mean to be part of a community and to have civic renewal, the environment, homelessness, all issues that matter to us. And there are some ways that I think people in this room who are diametrically opposed in some instances will be totally aligned on other topics. And so I'd like to do this through the Interfaith Center and with the Wilkes Institute and other community organizations and expand those organizations over time. There's an African proverb that I love that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I'd like to go far when it comes to building community across differences, not necessarily just in spite of differences, right? And so before you leave today, I would like you to introduce yourself to someone you don't know, right? Someone that you may have seen, but you don't know their name, or someone that is not in your class or not part of your faith group or what have you. Introduce yourself, thank them for coming, and look for more announcements and opportunities within this community. So can we give each other a hand clap? For those of you on Zoom, thank you for joining. Carrie, thank you for facilitating.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Dr. Hamlin. Thank you all for coming. All right, have a good day. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.